Everyone's been having an enjoyable, enriching time at our panels today. Again, if you have not met me, I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. I am thrilled to have the next plenary start because it features a group of public policy rising stars. With ongoing anti-Asian hate, APAICS' mission to increase Asian American representation is at the forefront in establishing more Asian American public policy thought leaders as congressional staff. As I mentioned earlier in my welcome remarks, every issue in this country touches the AA and HPI community. The establishment of the Racial Equity Social Justice Fellowship highlights the unique perspectives and challenges that affect this country from the Asian American lens. Before we hear from our fellows, I would like to thank our partner, General Motors, for their support in this effort. They were the first to jump in and say, how can we uplift the Asian American community? Their investment effectively doubled the size of the Fellows Program. Please give them a round of applause for their commitment to racial equity and social justice. I also want to recognize Ram Ramanujan. I had the good fortune of meeting him years ago when he came to DC for an APAICS legislative summit, much like this, and then attended other APAICS programming. And he has been a vocal advocate for the community, so thank you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce someone who I've had the pleasure of knowing in his previous life as a legislative aide. I'm speaking of Noel Perez, Director of Government Affairs at General Motors. He has served as Director of Outreach at the Senate Democratic Steering and Outreach Committee, and previously for then Congressman Javier Becerra as a policy aide and as the advisor for Member Services and Outreach for the House Democratic Caucus. He has been an ally for the Asian American community, and I'm fortunate to call him my friend. Please welcome Noel Perez.
Hello, everyone. Noel here. I just want to go back and touch on why is General Motors here? What brings us to the table? And you have to go back to February of 2021 in Georgia. Unfortunately, there was a terrible, terrible crime that happened that impacted the lives of our AA and HPI community. And in Georgia, General Motors has employees. We have thousands of employees in Georgia. And they spoke up and they said, what can we do? What can General Motors do? And what came out was a $1 million pledge to combat this situation that happened in Georgia and what was happening in the summer, and this systematic change that is so desperately needed. And what ended up happening is the $1 million, $500,000, $500,000 was donated to APAICS to help establish this fund. And the rest were towards the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Organization of Chinese Americans, and at Smithsonian, the API Digital Profile Series. I think this is important because as Madeline just highlighted, Ram, and he spoke up. And he was able to have that conversation internally with myself, with the rest of the team to say, this is something important for us. So I just want to thank Ram again for all your work and what you've done, not just for this community, but for General Motors. So very sad to see you go. I know he's given 33 years at General Motors, and I just asked him, can you give another 33? But unfortunately, he's retiring. So thank you. And I do want to also mention Tanya Skilton, who's sitting right next to Ram with General Motors at the Bright Drop Division. She is someone that you'll be seeing around for the next 2 days, and these folks are coming from Detroit. So please introduce yourselves. Just the last thing I want to mention is that this fellowship is important because I was once a a congressional intern. I came from an underserved community where I didn't have resources. I did not have the resources to book a flight, housing, to get a stipend. And I was fortunate I was able to do it through the Leon Panetta Public Policy Institute. And I thought it was only going to be 10 weeks on Capitol Hill, but that lasted to 10 years. So it definitely opened a door, multiple doors, and I'm forever thankful because as you all can imagine, or if you all have been able to see with your own eyes, when you walk the halls of Congress, there tends to be a lack of diversity, not just from gender, from race, to region, to ethnicity, languages, you name it. So there's programs like APAICS, organizations like APAICS that provide the means, the platform for organizations like companies like General Motors to partner and to provide these opportunities to share our stories. So I'm very excited about what we're going to do. Just in a couple minutes here, every single one is going to come up and share a little bit about what they're doing. And I got a sneak peek a couple weeks ago, so I'm very excited. And this is just a start for these individuals. And lastly, thanks again, Madalene, and APAICS for all the good work that you all do. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Noel, for your remarks, and thank you, GM, for your support in our Racial Equity Fellowship Program. So good afternoon, my name is Danielle Moon. I'm the Director of Programs and Community Engagement at APAICS. I work very closely with our wonderful fellows, so I'm incredibly proud of their accomplishments so far. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our fellows for their policy presentation. So first, we'll hear from Priya Milaneni.
Hi, everyone. My name is Priya Milaneni, and I am placed at the office of Senator Alex Padilla. I have known that I wanted to go into public service for basically as long as I can remember. My grandparents moved here in the 1960s at a pretty tumultuous time in the United States' history. If you look at that top picture, that's actually a picture of my mom and her sister during their first visit to Washington, D.C. in the 70s. And my grandparents were able to achieve the American dream for themselves and for their grandkids and their children. And they always made sure that I knew that was because of the hard work that folks had done to make the United States more accessible to immigrants and people of color. I've always had a passion for making the systems that we work within accessible to folks so that everyone has the same opportunities that my family did. And that's why in college I decided to major in political science and biology and minor in health disparities in society because I wanted to understand how the different systems in the United States worked to both uplift people in the ways that they are maybe harming people. After college, I worked in refugee social policy, so looked at the different social policies that exist to uplift refugee communities and help them acclimate into the United States. So prior to this fellowship, I had mostly been working in state and local policy, which is why I was so excited to receive the fellowship and learn more about how the congressional policy process works, and especially to work for a California senator. I am originally from Florida, but California has been a perfect place to do my fellowship because it does have 1/3 of Asian Americans in the United States. So we see that any equity issues that show up in the United States are definitely going to be in California just because of the sheer number of AAPI folks that live there. So it's also, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in California, and they have been since 2000. And if we look kind of from a youth perspective, API students are 12% of California's 6.2 million students. So a lot of young folks there as well. My area of focus in my office is health equity and health policy. The senator I work for really does focus on looking at health policy from a health equity lens, and that is basically just acknowledging that there's different systems that exist in our healthcare system and society broadly that mean that people can't achieve the peak level of health that they should be able to. So we look at different policies that exist that will help reduce those types of disparities. So just like focusing in on a topic that's a little bit more narrow, youth mental health, that's something that I'm really passionate about, and the senator that I work for is very passionate about as well. So if we look at API, mental health disparities, so those are issues that arise specifically to the systems that impact API youth. One thing that we'll see is that because of the rise in anti-Asian hate, a lot of studies have shown that API youth are stressed out and depressed and scared. And unfortunately, we also see that API folks have the lowest help-seeking behavior. So what that means is they're the least likely to go to a mental health professional if they have a mental health concern. On top of that, California has a pretty high student-to-counselor ratio, meaning that students don't necessarily have access to school counselors that they might need. And schools are actually a safety net for a lot of different health concerns. So when folks have different documentation statuses, or folks come from immigrant communities where maybe they're not as familiar with the mental health resources that exist within the United States, schools act as a way to make sure those kids are getting the help that they need. So the fact that there aren't enough counselors means that it's particularly impacting API youth who are often children of immigrants or have different documentation statuses. So one of the roles that I play in my senator's office is looking at the different bills that come up and seeing what he should be sponsoring. What should we get on and what should we support to make sure that we're really serving API youth and youth across California and the country? And one of those bills is the Mental Health Services for Student Act of 2021. And it's a pretty simple program. It is basically just giving grants to schools to make sure that they can hire more mental health providers, as well as increasing the federal medical assistance percentage, which is another funding stream to hire more mental health providers. I think that bills like this are examples of why it's so important to have diverse voices in these spaces. I know that my perspective as an Asian American is the reason that I was able to sign on to this bill and get our senator to really strongly support it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya. Next up, you'll hear from Royce Chen.
Hi, everyone. Wait, hello? Hi, okay. Yeah. Let me first tell you a little bit about me, but first I wanted to thank the APAICS family and also GM as well for making this opportunity possible. My name is Royce Chen, and I am really glad to be placed in Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence's district, who represents parts of Detroit and Southeast Michigan. My background is in chemical engineering, and I also studied philosophy at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was really passionate growing up about energy and environment issues, and that made me in college seek out opportunities. So I did a co-op with BP, working at 3 oil refineries throughout America, and I also conducted renewable energy research with my professors. But I found myself pulled towards, as I was more politically involved in college, into public service. So following the footsteps of my mom, I was a teacher, taught high school math in Philadelphia through Teach for America, and and afterwards, what I saw is that I wanted to see how to expand impact outside of the classroom. And I had an opportunity with the DC City Council this past summer, working with them to increase food access for BIPOC communities in wards 5, 7, and 8 in Washington, DC. But here in DC, seeing Capitol Hill, I did want to see what it would be like at the federal level. And that's where I'm really grateful for this fellowship, because I had not seen a path forward or a way to really get my foot in the door. And this fellowship really has allowed me to accomplish that. And it has also allowed me to learn and contribute to my office in ensuring that federal policies keep in mind the diversity of our country. So I handle environment, energy, and health in my office. So one of the main priorities, especially also in the state of Michigan, is ensuring that BIPOC communities get investments for clean, reliable, and affordable water. Now, when we look at the average age of water and sewer pipes in America, the average age is 45 years old. But some, especially in the cities and towns, especially where AAPI communities are, it can be up to a century old. This means that you can have pipes that have lead, that have other contaminants, that aren't as reliable. And for communities that don't have that many resources, that are underrepresented, it means that they're unable to repair these pipes and ensure something that should be a universal right, which is the access to clean water. Now, public water systems that violate the Safe Drinking Water Act, and this was a report released by the EPA in 2019, are 40% more likely to serve people of color, and they're far slower to be fixed due to the lack of resources. So at Rep. Lawrence's office, it is a priority to ensure that water and access to safe water is a focus. So we've done that through a couple of ways. The first would be community project funding, which also used to be called earmarks. And in fiscal year 2022, we were able to get $1.6 million for the constituents of Michigan's 14th district, especially prioritizing communities that wouldn't be able to get that funding otherwise. Now, in the upcoming fiscal year, we're aiming for $7.5 million, especially $6 million for the city of Hamtramck, which includes one of the largest Bangladeshi communities in America. Now, other things is also through amendments, such as through the Competes Act, which is not just a chip bill or a supply chain bill, it is a huge research bill, and amending that so research into climate change impacts on our water systems include low-income and underserved communities. Now, something that started long before I got there, but we're continuing to push and help shepherd in, is the Water Act of 2021, which our office partnered with Congressman Ro Khanna and Senator Sanders, and the bill would create a water trust to invest nearly $35 billion in our water infrastructure, prioritizing communities in need, communities of color, and those that are underrepresented. Now, we have, as of today, around 100 members of Congress that have signed on, and we're hoping to gain more and more momentum on this. But water is a universal right. Everyone should have the access to clean drinking water, and I'm really glad through this fellowship to help contribute a small part to this, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Royce. Now you'll hear from Devki Dave.
Good afternoon. My name is Devki Dave, and today I will be chatting a little bit about the work I do. Firstly, just again to echo everyone's sentiments, thank you so much to APAICS, to GM for sponsoring us, for making this pathway forward for us to be here on the Hill and following our public service dreams. I'm currently placed in Senator Catherine Cortez Mastro's office, and I spent the last 3 years in Las Vegas, Nevada. So Senator Cortez Masto is a senior senator from Nevada. I'm originally a native Texan. Show of hands, has anyone been to Texas? Okay, keep your hands up if you've lived in Texas. Cool. Has anyone lived in or visited Nevada? Hands up, okay. Keep your hands in the air if you left outside of the Las Vegas metro area. Okay. Cool. So that's very helpful to know because oftentimes folks only think of Las Vegas when they think of Nevada. But Nevada is a huge and diverse state. Just as it's been mentioned in presentations prior to mine, the AAPI population nationwide is one of the fastest growing populations. We are the fastest growing demographic also in the state of Nevada. As you can see, between 2000 and 2019, the population exploded by over 175%. Something else that folks may not know about Nevada is that we have the greatest affordable housing shortage in the nation. For me, housing is something that's particularly personal and special because as a kid, the one thing I really dreamed about was having a house, my own room, maybe a yard, but at least my own room. I hated having to share with my siblings and my cousins. And thanks to policies and programs, my parents were able to attain that dream when I was 9 years old. So I did finally get to have my own room, which was amazing. And of course, I decorated it. Anyway, moving on to how that feeds into the work I'm doing today. We know that there is housing insecurity for a lot of communities. We don't necessarily read about it for the AAPI community. That's partly because it's largely underreported due to lack of visibility. So a local count in Nevada found a point in time in southern Nevada, just for the area of Las Vegas and surrounding metro area, found that nearly 5%, a little under 5% of southern Nevada residents who were homeless were AAPI. But we knew that this number was not necessarily reflecting accurate count, because we know that through anecdotes and community service organizations in southern Nevada, there are instances in which as many as 3 families live together in a single household. So something I get to work on in Senator Cortez Masto's office is housing, affordable housing policy and banking policy. Like my colleagues in our fellowship program, we get to look at policies and proposals for legislation and try to recommend which ones our senators should champion. So something that was in the pipeline before I joined the office was Senate Bill 1684, which is the Federal Home Loan Bank's Mission Implementation Act. Essentially, that legislation creates affordable housing program funding through the Federal Home Loan Bank system. So Nevada's Federal Home Loan Bank, the region we fall under is the San Francisco Federal Home Loan Bank. And something that I've been actively involved in this year has been really advocating to create an affordable housing program targeted specifically for Nevada through our regional bank in San Francisco. Something else that I've been involved in is helping urge federal agencies and lenders who are operating in Nevada in the homeownership space to really think about what they're doing through the lens of racial equity. The 3 top languages spoken in Nevada, for instance, are English, Spanish, and Tagalog, which is because we have a very large Filipino population. So recently, the FHFA, or Federal Housing Finance Agency, announced that they were going to include language access and housing counseling resources on something called the URLA, or the Uniform Residential Loan Application, which is essentially just a form that would allow a new homeowner or applicant buying a home to be able to put down what language they speak, which helps for not just data collection, but also targeting resources to where they're most needed. So families, just like mine, can have access to their first home. We're also actively involved in looking at the pledges made in the aftermath of the horrific events to which I believe Noel referenced earlier today. But we want to make sure that all of the resources are being mobilized in our communities, and whether they're being mobilized in Nevada or not. We're also supporting small business franchise owners, many of whom identify as South Asian and Asian in Nevada, through these 2 pieces of legislation. Unfortunately, I don't have more time to chat today, so we can talk about those later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devki. Next, you'll hear from Ali Fazal.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ali Fazal, and I'm a Racial Equity Fellow with APAICS. I'm excited to share exactly what I've been up to for about the past 7 months or so. But before I get started, I wanted to thank GM, our corporate sponsor, and APAICS for making this Racial Equity Fellowship a possibility. Now, a bit about me. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. My parents came from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and so that's my cultural background. I was raised in the Southeast, lived in the Middle East for part of my life as well. But growing up, I think I was always really interested in politics. Didn't really see many folks from my background represented. But when I went to college at UNC Chapel Hill, I got involved with local politics there, did a lot with the Orange County Democratic Party. I was the first vice chair, helped a lot with the organizing there. And then after graduating from UNC in 2020, I got involved with the Biden-Harris coordinated campaign in North Carolina. I was a field organizer in my home state, which was incredibly fulfilling work. But I think I always knew that my heart lied on Capitol Hill and that's where APAICS came in. They placed me with Senator Tammy Duckworth's office of Illinois. There I work as a legal fellow for the Judiciary and Homeland Security team, and some of the things I work on are the court system, civil rights and voting rights, and oversight of different federal departments. Now, with regards to the court system, the Biden administration has really prioritized professional and personal diversity in the federal courts. And so that's meant that he's overseen the most diverse slate of judicial nominees in U.S. federal history. And it's been really fulfilling for me to be a part of that process. Just some of the folks that we've helped nominate: Judge Nancy Maldonado, which is the Northern District of Illinois' district judge. She would be the first Latina to be in that district, judicial district. And then we have Judge John Lee, who is the first Asian American to sit on the Seventh Circuit. Now, what exactly I do in this process is that I do the internal vote memorandums. And so that means I do research on the court background. And I analyze the ethics, experience, the expertise, the community stakeholder views, and the biographies of each nominee, write up a report for Senator Duckworth to have and reference when she's voting on the floor for these folks. I think the highlight of my fellowship so far has definitely been getting really a backdoor view of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's ascension to the Supreme Court. I'm sure all of you guys have been just as fixated on that over the past few months. I was able to sit in on the committee hearings, do the internal vetting memos for our office, and help draft some of the talking points for Senator Duckworth for various media appearances that she had and interviews. I was also able to sit in on the courtesy meeting between Senator Duckworth and Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. So each senator essentially gets a behind closed doors meeting with the Supreme Court nominee. It's one of the oldest traditions in the Senate, and I got to help draft the questions that Senator Duckworth asked the nominee, which was really wonderful to be a part of. One of the questions I helped draft was asking Judge Jackson about the Korematsu versus United States case. I try to bring my racial equity lens to everything I do, and this is just one case of that. This case focused specifically on the internment camps for Japanese Americans during World War II, and I essentially asked her about whether she viewed it as settled law or not. Some other work I do is in the civil rights, voting rights arena. The Senate tried to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act recently, a few months back, which essentially would restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Amendment protections to combat voter suppression laws that we're seeing at the state level. Now, obviously, that unfortunately did not pass, but Senator Duckworth's staff, the Judiciary staff, really tried to refocus on smaller, easier bills that we could maybe get through the Senate. And so an example of that is the PROVE Act, which is the Pre-Registration of Voters Everywhere Act. It essentially standardizes at a federal level the pre-registration for voters that we currently have in about 20 states nationwide. So if you go and get a ID through the DMV and you're not 18 years old, maybe you're 16 getting a permit, once you hit 18, you will automatically already be registered to vote, just taking away one of the more barriers from voting that we have in this country. And also, it gave $25 million in funding towards civic engagement curriculum in our school systems. And I also work on oversight of different federal departments. That's also one of the most important roles of the Senate, is that we write letters to the various departments, such as DHS. For example, with the southern border, something that's in the news a lot right now is the Title 42 immigration order from the CDC. And essentially, I analyzed the DHS's plan to replace that. Recently, it's got held up in the federal courts, but DHS released their plan essentially on how to replace that with different measures. And also, with the Afghan refugee situation, I helped provide oversight on Operation Allies Welcome, which is the interagency refugee operation at the federal level. Now, this is just a few of the things that I've been able to work on. Once again, I want to thank APAICS, and I also want to thank GM for this opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ali. Next up is Eric Kim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Eric Kim. So just a little about myself before I start with what I've been working on my placement. I am from Irvine, California, which currently is made up of 40% Asian Americans. And I went to the University of California, Irvine, which has 30% Asian Americans. So growing up my entire life and well into my adult ages, I never felt like a minority. My first move to DC in 2017 for law school, I went to the Catholic University of America School of Law. And it was at that moment I finally understood what it felt like to be a minority. So, in addition to my experience growing up as a majority minority and also my experience going to law school where I felt like a minority, coupled with the very difficult past couple of years that our community has been facing, I thought to myself, what could I possibly pursue that would be able to combine my past experiences with, my love and admiration for my community? And I finally found the APAICS Fellowship, and I applied to it, I would say 5 days before it was due. So thank you to APAICS for creating the fellowship, and thank you to GM for funding the fellowship. I am placed in the House Financial Services Committee Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion. This specific subcommittee on diversity and inclusion is the first of its kind, and it was formed in the 116th Congress by Chairwoman Maxine Waters. One of the duties that I have working for the subcommittee is to ensure that committee hearings have a diverse panel of witnesses. Since being on this subcommittee, we have elevated 7 Asian American witnesses from December through May. Oftentimes, Asian Americans are ignored in many fields, whether it's academics or whether it's anything dealing with the financial services industry. It's not because these professionals aren't there, it's because they are ignored. So this subcommittee, luckily, with the guidance of my director, has been ensuring that a diverse set of voices are being elevated and giving testimonies on the hearings that the Financial Services Committee has been hosting. Another task that I have been helping the subcommittee with is the collection of diversity data for the largest firms in the country. This is the third data collection that we have been doing through the committee. The first was diversity inclusion data for the largest banks in the country. The second was the diversity inclusion data for the largest investment firms in the country. And the third is, like I mentioned, the largest insurance firms. We are collecting data from the biggest life insurance and property casualty insurance companies in the country. I believe the data is collected from 28 companies. We have just started getting all of this data in, and we are working on analyzing the data and hopefully creating a report that will be accessible to the public once it is done. Diversity is needed in all levels of large industries such as insurance and investment firms and banks. Oftentimes, these big companies will use diversity and inclusion as almost an advertisement or something to brag about, but oftentimes they do not follow through with these promises and don't really do anything with the diversity and inclusion. So by making these reports public and by making these reports accessible to the public, we would hope that the public would use this information to choose companies that actually follow through with their diversity and inclusion initiatives. Ironically, professionals in the AAPI community are the least likely to be promoted to senior roles, which is something that we are looking at through this data that we're getting, especially AAPI women, which I've always found to be very ironic because the AAPI women in my life are the hardest working and the people that should be promoted. So thank you again for coming to this event, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate your support. Next, we'll hear from Sharon Kwan.
Okay. Ni hao, aloha, annyeonghaseyo, xin chao, hello, and konnichiwa to all of our distinguished guests, board members, and APAICS staff and alumni present this afternoon. My name is Sharon Kwan, and I'm currently placed on the House Committee on Education and Labor, working on K-12 and higher education issues. Before I begin, I would like to thank APAICS and the House Committee on Ed and Labor for this opportunity, and to the sponsor of our program, GM, for making this possible. I'm a second-generation Korean American, born and raised in Connecticut, and I've spent most of the last 10 years living in Virginia. While serving on the committee, I had the opportunity to help the committee prepare for a hearing on the important role that MSIs, so minority serving institutions, have in closing the racial equity gap in higher education in this country. On March 2nd, 2022, the chairwoman of the House Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Investment, Alma Adams, oversaw a hearing where we had the opportunity to hear from several members of institutions and experts who were able to testify on the important work that they were doing to ensure that students of color had opportunities to experience economic mobility. The hearing addressed the critical role that MSIs play in ensuring that HSIs, so Hispanic Serving Institutions, PBIs, predominantly Black institutions, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and APAICS, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, have in helping students of color achieve their dreams of attaining higher education. From the beginning of the process, in preparing for this hearing, as a committee, we were committed to making sure that we had a diverse representation on our panel that reflected this country. And so to represent Asian Americans, we had testimony from Dr. Robert Ternishi of UCLA, an expert on APAICS. We also heard testimony from Dr. Jose Luis Cruz Rivera, representing an HSI, and Dr. Patricia Ramsey, who is the president of Medgar Evers College. As a committee, we received a lot of support from MSIs and advocacy groups across the country who are eager to share their concerns and also uplift the work that they were doing. Many institutions had the opportunity to launch or robustly fund programs to support their students with $26 billion from the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan. This infusion of much-needed investment really transformed the way that institutions were able to serve their students. The hearing gave all participants the opportunity to look at the potential economic and racial justice impact that funding these institutions can have. The testimony that the panel of experts provided also indicated that MSIs play a disproportionately critical role in ensuring that students of color achieve economic mobility, particularly for those that are from underserved communities. By increasing our investment in MSIs, we can double or even triple the number of minority students entering critical workforce needs, particularly in STEM. This is not simply an issue of ensuring socioeconomic equity, but meeting 21st century workforce goals to keep this nation competitive. The hearing also highlighted one of the basic critical needs that APAICS face, which is a lack of data. APAICS, along with other MSIs, need data in order to understand the needs of their students and assess their path forward to best meet those needs. APAICS often lack the resources to pursue federal grant funding that they need to really move the needle in terms of completion and postgraduate workforce participation. APAICS, like the rest of the country, are becoming much more diverse and will need further investment and resources to ensure that they're well equipped to serve their students. By addressing the challenges that come with serving students that are often first or second generation immigrants, DACA recipients, ELL learners, and the first in their families to go to college, APAICS are critically positioned to help close the equity gap in higher education and the workforce. All of you present this evening have already done your part just by supporting the work of APAICS with your time and your resources. Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do.
All right, thank you, Sharon. Next, we'll hear from Patrick Peralta.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Peralta. I am a APAICS Racial Equity Fellow. First of all, I just want to thank APAICS for supporting our fellowship, giving us the opportunity to present the work that we're doing in our Congressional office, and also to thank GM for the generous sponsorship of our fellowship. So in my fellowship, I've been placed in the office of Congressman Gregorio Sablan. Congressman Sablan, since 2009, has been the first and only representative from the Northern Mariana Islands to Congress. So you'll see on the map here that the Northern Marianas is a U.S. territory very far away from the mainland in the middle of the Pacific, just above Guam. But geographic distance is not the only way that we are removed from the mainland and from the mainstream. Many Pacific Islanders live in the margins of margins. They are disenfranchised, low income, not included even in mainstream conversations about the API community, and much less removed from policy discussions. But most importantly, the territories are excluded from many federal policies and programs that states take for granted. So therefore, equity is really the mission of our office. And so this is really rewarding because we're constantly filling in gaps within the federal government. And also this connects to the goal of our fellowship, which is equity. There's something that our legislative director tells me and the rest of the legislative team all the time, that if the Marianas and other U.S. territories are not explicitly mentioned in a bill, or if they're not included in the statutory definition of a state, then we are automatically no longer a beneficiary of the legislation's provisions. And those who work on the Hill know how difficult it is to retroactively include an entity in legislation. So because equity is the legislative mission of our office, I actually don't have a policy focus. I work on all issues that at the heart have the mission of equity. And so these are the three issues that I've been working on in the office. So the first is SNAP. SNAP is a federal program that gives low-income Americans the access to food and nutrition. It used to be called food stamps. And the Marianas, along with 2 other territories, are not eligible within SNAP. So inclusion in SNAP is actually one of the motivations that led Congressman Sablan to Congress and is his only priority on the Agricultural Committee. So while the Congressman is working to include the Marianas in SNAP, we rely on block grants, which are fixed sums of money from the federal government, and the Congressman is constantly trying to shore up money for the Marianas in these temporary blocks of money. Recently, I drafted a letter to the White House asking the President to maintain the raised $30.7 million in federal funding, and this was raised from $12 million before. And our office was really glad in March to know that the White House increased this funding and is reflected in the 2023 budget. The next program that I've been working on is Title 1A. And so this is funding for disadvantaged K-12 schools and low-income students. And since 2021, Congressman Sablan has been leading the appropriations letter in Congress to increase Title 1A funding. I was really glad to help him circulate this letter throughout the congressional offices. And this year, we garnered 108 members of Congress to support our effort, which is 19 more from the last. And Congressman Sablan is really happy with this turnout, not only because it supports his work as chair of the K-12 Education Subcommittee, but because this more than doubles the current funding and would greatly benefit districts like ours. But the biggest project I've been working on so far is actually original legislation. So, as Sharon mentioned, APAICS are Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions. And the goal of my bill is to shore up funding for these institutions. This concern arose from a visit from the only college in the Marianas, Northern Mariana College. And the president came to our Washington office and he was asking the congressman why Northern Marianas College and other NAPCs across the country aren't receiving a lot of funding, particularly for small colleges like NMC. And so after months of working with the Congressional Research Service, I found 2 issues that concern this problem. The first is that NAPCs actually receive the least amount of funding among all the minority-serving institutions across the country at $9.8 million. And this is even as NAPCs enroll around 40% of API undergrads across the country. And then the second problem is that not all NAPCs receive funding, which is not the same for a lot of other MSIs. In 2020, only 30 NAPCs out of 165 received grants, which is 18% of all eligible institutions. So the legislation that I'm working on behalf of Congressman Sablan would tackle these 2 problems. It would first create parallel programs for NAPCs that are currently available in other minority-serving institutions, and number 2, amend the Higher Education Act to establish mandatory funding for every NAPC institution so that no NAPC institution is without funding. And so I just hit you with a lot of statistics and programs, but if there's anything I want you to take away from today, it's that equity looks different for the Marianas and for the U.S. territories than other communities across the country. As long as the U.S. territories, particularly the Northern Mariana Islands, continue to be overlooked in and excluded from federal policies and programs, the work to fill in equity gaps continues. And to paraphrase the congressman himself, more federal aid is not sufficient. Rather, the kind, quality, and persistent of support is necessary for the territories to be truly incorporated in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Next, we'll hear from Mayawati Viriyappa.
Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing? Good? Still getting through it? Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Mayawati Viriyappa, but everyone in this room can call me May. You're welcome. It's a little bit easier. And I'm a racial equity fellow. So like the many people in this room, I also served people before I came into this fellowship, maybe just in a different way. I served people food. So I was actually a waitress before I came to this fellowship. And all jokes aside, as much as I loved being a waitress in my time at my hometown, I first really want to thank our sponsors, General Motors and APAICS, for giving me this opportunity. I learned so much this past few months, and this experience wouldn't have happened without your support, and it completely changed the trajectory of my life. I'm in Representative Mike Levin's office serving California's 49th District, and I manage the Foreign Affairs portfolio, API issues, and I assist in defense and veteran affairs. I'm going to quickly talk about my background and how I ended up in this fellowship. So my parents are both first-generation immigrants from Thailand, and I was actually born in Bangkok. At the top, you might see a very good-looking family. That is my family. Very proud to say that. And if you can kind of see in the back of the photo, you can see it actually says Grandparents' Day, despite those being in the photo being my parents. That is because to this day, we are the only ones in our family living in the US, and the rest of my family still lives in Thailand. Because of our situation, my parents have always emphasized the importance of looking abroad and monitoring the global situation, leading to my interest in foreign affairs. I grew up in Oklahoma, which, as you might expect, is predominantly white, and our state legislator mirrors that demographic. However, Oklahoma City is home to a robust Asian American refugee population, specifically Vietnamese refugees, which have heavily influenced my upbringing and my political priorities. Political participation in Oklahoma is extremely low. Oklahoma is ranked last in voter turnout repeatedly, with 53% of eligible Asian voters actually participating. In a way, this hardened my own political agency, and I studied political science and fine arts at George Washington University right here in DC. I had the privilege of being able to actually visit the 49th District in California in April. And besides being home to beautiful nature parks, as you can see in that photo of my wonderful staff, the 49th District has a strong sense of identity and community. And in some ways, it did remind me of my own home state, despite being surrounded by water versus in Oklahoma, where we're just surrounded by, well, land. Like Oklahoma, the district has a small AAPI population. However, a lesson that I've brought with me is just because a group is small does not mean they lack political agency or importance. Oftentimes, people don't participate in networks where they feel excluded. So how do we combat that? We outreach to them. This month, I've been working with our district office to recognize AAPI organizations and businesses, ranging from meetings with the congressman and also staff level meetings, and just offering certificates for all their hard work. Each meeting would serve as an introduction to the organization to identify their priorities, learn about their work, and discuss ways that our office can provide support. These meetings are meant to give an opportunity for AAPI leaders to share their perspectives in different roles, and hopefully build a long-lasting relationship that will outlast even my time at the office. So some of the organizations I want to give a quick shout out to that I literally met today. The Asian Americans Advocacy Group at UCSD, which was an organization that was created in 2020 during the peak of Asian American hate. And their purpose is to help others understand and recognize advancements and areas for growth within the Asian American community. Another group I want to shout out is the MANA program at the MiraCosta College. It's dedicated to building a community for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students that offers many support services towards their academic goals. And then finally, the United AAPI Artists empowers San Diego-based AAPI artists to support their creative potential, people, and become cultural bearers, whether working as independent artists or within institutions, and build more equitable and representative society. But beyond just the API Heritage Month activities, I also got to bring my experience within my own community with the Vietnamese diaspora to guide the bills that I get to work on, including the Afghan-Iraqi Allies Resettlement Improvement Act, which assists Afghan and Iraqi refugees to transition into the United States. This includes more language resources, employment programs, and data research. And I can't help but think of how these types of resources would have made such a drastic difference to the refugees that are currently in Oklahoma. I was able to memo this bill and add my congressman as a co-sponsor. So thank you so much for listening to me, for all the rewarding work I get to do, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
All right, thank you, May. So last but not least, Christian von Rotz will give his presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Christian. I'm from Modesto, California, and I am placed in the office of Congressman Bobby Scott. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to APAICS for the opportunity to be here and to GM for making this fellowship a possibility. Before I started this fellowship, I went to American University where I studied international relations. And immediately after that, I started working in campaigns as a field organizer in North Carolina and Georgia, and most recently in Virginia. I've brought those experiences with me through this fellowship with a heavy focus on community and working directly with individuals. So like I said, I'm placed in Congressman Bobby Scott's office. He represents the Virginia 3rd Congressional District in Hampton Roads, and he's the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, and he's also on the Budget Committee as well. I've been lucky enough to work on a wide-ranging issue area portfolio, and I'm currently the lead legislative staffer on foreign affairs, veterans affairs, immigration, civil rights, and voting rights, and I also help out a lot on healthcare as well. So one thing I wanted to talk about is utilizing the racial equity lens of this fellowship. I applied to this fellowship specifically because of the racial equity focus. It's something that's been very near and dear to my heart my entire time growing up. As half Filipino and half white, it's something that I've faced every day in my life, so something that's really drew me to this fellowship. In my time, I've realized that applying this racial equity lens to policymaking is a decision we have to make every day in how we conduct our meetings, what bills we look at for co-sponsoring, how we have our conversations with our congressional member or our staffs. It's an everyday task, and it has to be intersectional as well. Thankfully, my office dynamic has really allowed for this lens. Congressman Scott's one of the senior members of the Congressional Black Caucus and KPAC as well, so issues of racial equity are very near and dear to his heart as well. So, as I said, I handle a wide-ranging issue area portfolio, so I wanted to talk about a couple of those topics I've been able to deal with, one of those being healthcare disparities. So I meet with pretty much all of the constituent groups and stakeholder groups that want to meet with Congressman Scott's office. And we, in preparing for those meetings and in taking those meetings, we really try to focus our questions and how we conduct those meetings on racial equity and highlighting those racial and socioeconomic disparities, both in patient outcomes, in the healthcare system. And I've been able to work on a bit of like a nexus between that and Veterans Affairs with TRICARE and Medicare and Medicaid and gaps within those three areas. One thing I also want to talk about is the Death in Custody Reporting Act. So early on in my fellowship, I was able to write the first draft of a letter to the Department of Justice on this bill. So Congressman Scott sponsored this bill in 2013, and it became law in 2015. But it mandated federal law enforcement agencies and state and local law enforcement agencies to report any and all deaths in custody that year. And also the Department of Justice was supposed to make reports every year regarding those deaths in custody to inform policymakers on why these deaths in custody are happening and why they're predominantly people of color. Since that law was made, there has been little data collection and little data reporting. So I was able to draft a first letter on those shortcomings to request more information from the Department of Justice. It's still ongoing work, so I can't say too much more about it, but hopefully that letter will be out this year. The last thing I want to talk about is a Muslim community roundtable event that I was able to create talking points and a background memo for the congressman that went on in the district. The Muslim community leaders wanted to discuss Afghan and Iraqi refugee resettlement, both in Virginia and across the U.S., the disenfranchisement of Muslims in India, and H.R. 5665, the Combating International Islamophobia Act. So that bill has already passed the House. Congressman Scott voted in favor of it, so I was able to let them know that he did that. And that bill would create a special envoy within the State Department that tracks Islamophobic acts across the world and creates reports every year based on each country highlighting those acts. While creating these talking points and this background memo, I really got to reflect on why I chose to do this fellowship and the importance of the work that we do here. I knew that these Muslim community leaders wanted to meet with their elected officials to talk about the issues that matter to them, that they see in their daily lives. And I was able to help prepare those talking points and prepare the congressman for that so they can hear directly from him and his perspectives on it as well. So thank you all so much for your time, and thank you again to APAICS and GM.
All right, this is the last time I'm coming up here. So let's give a warm round of applause for our fellows for their presentation. Before we close, I just want to acknowledge our fellows had a very busy time on the Hill with appropriation season, and they were still able to kick ass in their presentation. So great job, great work. I hope everyone enjoyed their policy brief and feeling inspired and hopeful about our future because these are our leaders. And so this concludes this session. So I hope everyone enjoyed today's activities and have a great evening.